really excited to have you guys all here for Civics Day. I'm going to say a few words before we throw it upstairs to what really matters, which is the judging portion. So as you guys may know, in addition to New York City, Generation Citizen has sites in Boston, Providence, and all the way in the San Francisco Bay Area. So today is actually the first of 4 Civics Days we're going to have throughout the week. Now the thing that I always love most about Civics Day in New York, or until now, at least in the past I've loved about Civics Day in New York, is that New York always has the most energy, by far. So you guys So to kick it off, just wondering, I think most people made it, but let's see. All right, so who is here from the Bronx today? Yeah! All right. What about Queens? Because of the snow, but do we have anyone here from Staten Island? They didn't say fair here, so they get extra props. And then last but certainly not least, the borough that I live in, Brooklyn. So, in the last few days, I've been thinking a lot about Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa. So, I was going to ask, how many of you guys know about Nelson Mandela? So, the short of it is after protesting against an oppressive South African government that repressed black Africans, segregating them from whites, Mandela was sent to jail for 27 years. And he sacrificed everything for the sake of his country, including, in many cases, his family. When he was finally released, he won the presidency in the first truly democratic elections in South Africa. His story is an inspiration to millions, including all of us in this room. And earlier today, almost 90,000 people gathered in South Africa to pay homage to him, including President Obama. When I was in the 10th grade, so the same age as many of you, I actually had the opportunity to visit Rhode Island, the jail where Mandela spent the majority of his 27 years of captivity. Seeing the incredibly small cell where the future leader spent his days was incredibly humbling. His journey from that cell to world icon is perhaps the most inspiring story that I know of. Earlier, just this morning, at his memorial service in South Africa, President Obama asked, with honesty, regardless of our station or circumstance, we must ask, how well have I applied his lessons in my own life? I think that's a question we can ask of ourselves today. How can we make today the start of a Mandela moment, both in our own lives and in our society? When Mandela was first imprisoned in 1964, the majority of the world was actually okay with it. The United States actually stood by the South African government and its apartheid regime. Just 40 years ago, it was seen as okay for a government to systematically oppress black people and impose life sentences on those who rallied against it. By the time he was released from prison in 1990, this was seen as a universal wrong, but at the time, it was not. History, which I hope all of you pay attention in, is a case study in righting social and moral wrongs. When we look back, we often ask how people could have been so reckless and thoughtless in their interactions with fellow humans. Up until 1865, this country thought enslaving black people made sense, that they constituted 3/5 of a person. Up until 1920, less than 100 years ago, this country thought that women should not be allowed to vote. Until the 1960s, this country thought that blacks and whites should eat food in different restaurants and sleep in different hotels and go to different schools. Up until 1990, we thought it was okay for South Africa to treat blacks differently from whites. And even in current times, women make less than men, and we discriminate based on sexual orientation, and racial inequality is rampant. And so, I guarantee you that when we look back on 20 years from today, 30 years, when we look back on today, we will be astounded at some of the realities of the day that we allowed to happen. The question is, what those realities will be. The question is, what issues will make up our Mandela moment? And the answer, I think, is up to you. In Generation Citizen this semester, we helped you take action on issues that you care about. But we essentially taught you to take action when the system actually works. When democracy pays attention to all of its people. If you care about X, then you should do Y. If you care about gang violence or public transit or keeping your school bathrooms cleaner, all important issues that you guys will talk about later today, then you should take these steps and you'll begin to reach your goals. And all of those steps, from contacting decision makers to getting media attention to mobilizing others, are necessary. I do believe that. But what happens when the system doesn't work? What happens when the system is unjust? Because here's the truth. Right now, the system in this country doesn't work. It's not fair. Not all voices are equal. You know this. And in 20, 30, 40 years, we're all going to look back and be fairly astounded that we allowed some of the conditions that we see today in our backyard to occur. And what frustrates me most of all is that we are unable to talk about these issues in an honest way. Issues like the fact that in this city, over 1/5 of our citizens are poor. That some of you, many of you, go to schools without the resources you need to succeed while the schools next to you have flat screen TVs and connected classrooms. That essentially today in our schools we segregate again based on race, based on class. That many of you have been stopped and frisked by policemen solely because of the color of your skin. That 22,000 children in New York City are homeless, the greatest number since the Great Depression. This is not okay. And it means in many cases the system does not work. But I'll tell you something else. These problems do not get solved by someone like me. I can help, I hope. But Mandela was such a powerful voice in ending apartheid in South Africa precisely because he was discriminated against based on the color of his skin. You, as our next generation, as young people that have been exposed to many of these inequalities, need to be the next leaders of this country. You need to solve these problems. As Mandela once said, overcoming poverty is not a task of charity. It is an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Sometimes it falls on a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. Let your greatness blossom. So, in our Mandela moment today, we need to recognize which issues are unjust, which issues are historical wrongs, and do our best to right them. But we also need to do so with respect. When Mandela was released from prison and became president, there were many that wanted him to retaliate against the whites, against the people who had imprisoned him for 27 years, against the people who had caused him so much despair and harm. And he refused. Instead, he worked with the same whites that had perpetuated those crimes against him and his people. He took a lot of grief for it, but it was the right thing to do. It's an important lesson for us in our country today. All too often, we pit ourselves against one another. Rich versus poor, black versus white, Democrat versus Republican. Or a people that like competition, and so our politics follow. And it's no surprise that we often fail to solve our problems. But as Mandela also said, people must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. We need to work together to improve our schools, combat economic inequality, and solve the other wrongs inherent in our world today. Which seems to make total sense, but never actually happens. I like sports analogies a lot, so here's one for you. I was lucky enough to go to the Jets game Sunday. And I realized something as I was watching. There's 11 men on a field for a team at a given time. And for the offense to do something positive, all 11 have to work together to accomplishment. The blocking has to be good, the quarterback has to make a good throw, the receiver has to make a good catch. But it takes one player to screw it up. One penalty, one bad block, one drop. That's all to say that it's much harder to work together to accomplish something than to splinter and screw it up. Think about your own classes this semester. How hard was it to work in groups? How frustrating was it when one of your classmates didn't pull their fair share? But how great did it feel when everybody actually came together? And so, thinking about Mandela, it's much easier to demonize people than to actually work together with them, especially when they think differently than you. But it's the only way that progress happens. And so I hope today is just the beginning of a lifelong journey of civic engagement. That's what Generation Citizen is all about. But I also hope that you'll take the lessons of Mandela with you. You learned a lot about taking action on issues you care about this semester. But I also know that you know the system isn't quite fair. And with that, I hope you will do everything in your power to make it a little more fair. We actually need you to work towards that goal. And I hope when you do so, you work together with people towards that goal, rather than demonizing others as enemies. It's going to be really, really hard. But as Mandela also said, it always seems impossible until it's done. So who's ready to change the world?